Section 1. The rear half starts to leave. The 1st of February, 1943. Over Tunisia, on the long pull home from the Bizerte and Tunis area. The sky has that hard winter clarity that makes every speck look closer than it is. The B-17F, All-American 4124406, rides a cold stream of air with 4 engines beating a steady rhythm. And inside the fuselage, the sound is never silence, only layers. Prop wash oxygen hiss, a heater that cannot keep up the click of interphone switches as men try to sound calm. You can feel the airplane through your boots, not a metaphor. A living vibration in the metal floor like the bomber is reminding you that it is the only thing holding you above a continent that does not care. The crew has one job now: get home. Not clean, not pretty, just home. The impossible problem arrives as a dot that becomes a shape that becomes a decision. Fighters, fast, low sun behind them. The gunners call out what they think they see. Records differ on exactly which fighters made the pass, but the outcome is consistent. The attackers come in with the kind of confidence that says they have done this before. Clock. The next 2 minutes decide everything. Stakes. If the bomber loses control surfaces, if the tail starts to wag, if the rear fuselage breaks away, you do not just lose altitude. You lose the airplane. You lose every man inside it. The rule against a fighter attack is simple. Do not let them settle in behind you. But rules are what you say when things are normal. This is not normal. The first burst rattles through the airframe like a fist on a door. The B-17 shudders, and the men brace without thinking. Another pass closer, and then in a moment that feels like bad math, the attacker gets too close. Metal meets metal. A collision, not a clean hit, not a cinematic explosion. Just a brutal, grinding impact that sounds like the airplane being torn open with a crowbar. For a heartbeat, the bomber is a bell that has been struck. Everyone hears it. Everyone feels it. Then the tail starts to drift, not fall away instantly. Drift as if the rear half of the airplane is trying to leave politely. In the cockpit, the pilot and co-pilot look at each other with the same thought you would have if you felt the floor shift under you in a burning building. Is the structure still there? Or are you standing on the part that is about to go? The airplane answers with a new vibration, wrong and uneven, like a shopping cart wheel that has gone loose at speed. Switch point of view, rear compartment. In the back, a gunner sees daylight where daylight does not belong. A seam has opened. The rear fuselage has been nearly severed, the kind of damage you do not expect an aircraft to stay in one piece with. The stabilizer looks misaligned. The tail seems to hang at an angle that makes your stomach tighten. You do not need engineering to understand what gravity wants. Someone grabs the nearest frame knuckles, white inside a thick glove. Another man reaches for an interphone cord, yanks it closer like it is a lifeline, and shouts what he sees into the mic. The words tumble over each other, clipped by fear and oxygen masks. Back in the cockpit, the pilot tries the controls. Nothing feels right. The yoke moves with a strange slackness. Responses lag as if the airplane is thinking about obeying. Somewhere along the body, control cables have been hit, stretched, or cut. The tail is still attached, but the nerves between hand and surface have gone numb. Clock. In the next 60 seconds, the bomber will either stabilize or start a spiral. You cannot stop. The co-pilot's eyes flick to a small detail almost nobody thinks about when they imagine aerial combat. Not a gun, not a medal. A simple length of safety wire twisted and clipped, holding a toggle guard in place near the autopilot controls. It is the kind of thing a ground crewman does on a rushed morning, fingers numb, using habit as much as sight. It is small, almost invisible, and it is still there, still tight, still doing its quiet job. That wire means the switch has not been bumped. It means one option has not been accidentally taken away. The navigator calls out heading corrections, trying to anchor the crew to something that can be measured. The bombardier glances at the bomb sight servo system, the same machinery meant to steady a bombing run, meant to make the airplane hold a line. In a cruel twist, the thing designed for offense might be the only thing left that can translate a human choice into steady flight. The rule against chaos is simple. If your hands cannot fly it, find something that can. They try the autopilot. The first second after it engages feels like stepping onto ice and waiting to see if it holds. The airplane wobbles, then steadies. Not perfect, not safe, but steadier. Mini payoff. The nose stops hunting. The wings stop rocking. The bomber holds a line long enough for everyone to take one breath that is not panic. That is the first win. Tiny, temporary, but real. And now here is where I step in for just a moment. If you are watching this and you want more stories where survival turns on one quiet choice, like the twist of a wire or the flip of a switch, take a second to like the video. And if you want to ride these moments with us, subscribe to Soldiers' Lost Voices. We do not chase spectacle here. We chase the detail that changes everything. Back inside the aircraft, the crew does not celebrate. They work. Switch point of view: the pilot. You can fly a bomber on autopilot in smooth air. You can even trust it on a straight line. But this is a wounded aircraft. The tail is compromised. The airflow over the damaged section is different now, unpredictable. Every gust is a question. The pilot keeps one hand close to the yoke anyway, not because it helps yet, but because letting go feels like surrender. Stakes. If they lose the autopilot, they may not get it back. If the tail shifts 1 inch more, it could tear. And if it tears, there is no forced landing. There is only the end. The navigator marks time in his head because distance is hard to judge when the horizon is empty. The bombardier watches the servo response like it is a heartbeat monitor. The gunners scan for another pass because even a damaged enemy fighter might try again. The crew has to do the next impossible thing. They have to steer home using a system not meant to be a steering wheel while keeping a broken airplane from shaking itself apart. Clock, the next decision is coming fast, because eventually they have to descend. And if the tail is barely holding on now, what happens when the air thickens, when the speed changes, when the pressure on that wounded seam shifts? The bomber holds steady for the moment, but the moment is running out. Previous section text. Section 2. Flying it home on borrowed stability. The bomber holds steady for the moment, but the moment is running out. The pilot watches the artificial horizon like it is a promise he does not fully trust. The airplane is no longer something you fly with confidence. It is something you negotiate with. Every second the autopilot keeps the nose level, feels borrowed. Clock 10 minutes until they have to start down, maybe less if the weather closes in or fuel becomes a question. Stakes: a descent changes everything. Denser air, changing loads, new pressures on that half-torn seam. If the tail shifts at the wrong time, it is not a scare anymore. It is separation. The rule against structural damage is simple. Do not shock the airframe. No sudden changes. No hard turns. No abrupt power moves that make the airplane argue with itself. Switch point of view: the navigator. In the nose, the navigator's world is numbers and small adjustments, but today the math feels like it is written on moving paper. He keeps the heading steady with his voice, not his hands. A few degrees left. Hold it. Now ease back. The crew is flying by committee, each man lending what he can. You can feel how careful they are, the way a group carries a heavy crate downstairs. Everyone moves slow because one stumble ends it. The bombardier leans toward the bomb site, controls the servo system that can nudge the airplane on a line. It was meant to help a bomb run stay true. Now it is a lifeline. He does not talk about it like a miracle. He talks about it like a tool. Because if you call it luck, you stop treating it with respect. In the cockpit, the pilot tests the damaged controls again gently, like touching a bruised rib. A hint of response, then slack. Not enough to trust. The co-pilot keeps eyes on engine instruments and the sky because a wounded bomber invites another pass. Outside, the air is quiet again, but it is not safe quiet. It is the pause after a door slammed, the hallway still vibrating. Clock 2 minutes until the next course correction. The pilot looks at the airspeed. Too fast and the damaged tail takes more load. Too slow and the bomber wallows and autopilot corrections become exaggerated, hunting for level flight. They need a narrow band, a sweet spot where the airplane feels least offended. The rule against panic is simple. Choose one thing to hold steady and make everything else serve it. So they choose stability. Switch point of view, the tail. In the rear, a gunner watches the torn seam with the kind of attention you usually reserve for a candle in wind. The tail is still there, still attached, but it is not rigid. It has a faint, wrong motion, like a door on loose hinges. Through the gap there is cold air and a glimpse of the world sliding by. He cannot see the control cables, but he can imagine them frayed and stretched, hidden inside the airplane's spine. He reports what he feels, not just what he sees. Vibration increasing. The rear is flexing. The words are simple because the truth is simple. Stakes. If that flex becomes a snap, there is no time to do anything about it. Up front, the pilot makes a choice that feels backwards. Instead of wrestling for control, he leans harder into the system they still have. Autopilot engaged. Small trim inputs only if they behave. The bombardier watches the servo response, ready to make tiny corrections like a man balancing a tray of water. Mini payoff. For another stretch of sky, the bomber stays level. The tail does not drift farther. The vibration stays the same, wrong but steady, like a bad toothache that stops getting worse. And then they have to face the part nobody wants to say out loud. They cannot stay up here forever. They need a landing field. They need a runway. They need a descent that does not rip the airplane in half. Clock, the first notch of descent is coming. 30 seconds, then they commit. The pilot calls for a slow power reduction, one engine at a time, gentle enough that the airframe does not lurch. The bomber's nose wants to drop. The autopilot fights it with small, almost polite corrections. The crew waits to see if the tail complains. It does. Not with a brake, not yet. With a shiver, a tiny oscillation that runs through the fuselage like a warning note. The pilot freezes his hands for a beat, then eases the power back up just a hair, finding that narrow band again. The rule against rushing is simple. If the airplane objects, listen. Switch point of view, the co-pilot. The co-pilot watches his pilot's face. Not heroic, concentrated. The kind of focus you see in a man threading a needle while the room shakes. He keeps his own voice calm because voices shape decisions. He calls airspeed, calls altitude, calls small changes. He does not say what he is thinking, which is that they are flying a broken machine by borrowed stability and hope. You watching from the ground years later might imagine courage is loud. This is quiet courage. It is measured in how slowly they move a lever. Another step down, another small correction. The bomber settles almost like it is willing to cooperate if nobody insults it. Clock, 5 minutes to the field if the wind holds and the heading stays true. Stakes, if the autopilot slips, if the servo corrections overshoot, if the tail starts to swing, they will have to hand fly a machine that no longer answers the hands. The bombardier keeps eyes on the control system, feeling for any hesitation. The navigator counts off distance. The rear gunner reports the tail's motion, his voice tight, his breathing loud in the mic. And then, just when the crew begins to believe the descent might be possible, the airplane gives them a new problem. The autopilot holds level, but the bomber starts to yaw slightly left, then right, searching for a center it cannot find. It is subtle at first, a gentle fishtail, then a little stronger. The pilot and co-pilot trade a glance, because a fishtail in a wounded B-17 is not a nuisance. It is a lever working on that damaged seam, testing it. Clock. They have less than a minute to stop the yaw before it becomes a swing. The pilot reaches for the one thing he has avoided, the human override. And he has to decide whether to fight the airplane with his hands or trust the failing system one more time. Section 3. Yaw rudder and one thin wire. The pilot reaches for the one thing he has avoided, the human override, and he has to decide whether to fight the airplane with his hands or trust the failing system one more time. He does both. One hand settles onto the yoke, not to wrestle but to feel. The other hovers near the autopilot, controls like a guard at a door that might burst open. The bomber is fishtailing now, a slow left-right search that grows sharper with each swing. In a healthy aircraft, it would be annoying. In this one, it is a pry bar working on a cracked joint. Clock 40 seconds until the yaw becomes a full swing. Stakes. If it swings hard, the tail takes a sudden side load. That is the kind of load that turns a near sever into a separation. The rule against a developing swing is simple. Stop it early, or you will not stop it at all. Switch point of view, the bombardier. In the nose, the bombardier watches the servo response like he is watching a needle on a gauge that can decide a life. The bomb sight system can help hold a line, but it was never meant to fight a wounded tail. The autopilot wants smooth corrections. The airplane is asking for something uglier, something human. He leans in and calls it out. Small inputs. Do not chase it. Let it settle. If you overcorrect, you feed it. In the cockpit, the pilot tests rudder pressure. Not dead, but uncertain, like pushing on a door that may not be attached to its hinges. Somewhere aft cables are damaged. The rudder might still move a little, or it might be moving in a way that does not match what his feet are asking for. Either way, he cannot count on it, so he looks for another lever that still talks to the air. The throttles. Technical detail, one you can picture. 4 engines, 4 propellers, and each one can pull a little more or a little less. You cannot steer a bomber this way like it is a boat, but you can nudge yaw. You can quiet a swing. Differential power is a blunt instrument, but it is an instrument they still have. Clock 20 seconds. The pilot calls it calmly. Left side, ease back a touch. Right side, hold. Not much. A breath of throttle, not a shove. The bomber answers with a pause in the swing as if it is surprised someone spoke its language. Mini payoff. The fishtail slows. The nose stops hunting for one long second. It is not fixed. It is managed. And management is survival. Switch point of view, the rear gunner. He feels the change before he sees it. The tail's vibration shifts from a sharp tremble to a steadier hum. The gap in the fuselage still breathes cold air. The seam still looks wrong, but the swinging load that was tugging at it has eased. He speaks into the mic, voice tight but controlled, yaw, reducing, tail holding. Up front, the co-pilot keeps his eyes on the small things that become the whole story. Engine temps, manifold pressure. A glance at the autopilot switch. That thin safety wire is still there, twisted and clipped, keeping the toggle guard from drifting, keeping the switch from being bumped in a moment of panic. A tiny piece of discipline holding the crew's last steady hand in place. The rule against losing your only tool is simple. Protect the one thing that is working. Clock 3 minutes to the next turn if they can risk any turn at all. Stakes a turn demands banking. Banking changes airflow. Airflow changes tail load. Even a gentle arc could pull on that damaged seam in a new direction. The navigator calls for the smallest correction possible, and the pilot agrees. No big banking turn. Just a drift, a slow bending of the line, a compromise between geometry and survival. The pilot uses what he has learned in the last 10 minutes. He lets the autopilot handle the smoothness, but he feeds it conditions it can live with. He keeps the airspeed in that narrow band. He uses throttle differences like a man using fingertips to steady a glass on a shaking table. Switch point of view, the co-pilot. He watches the pilot's hands and realizes something you only understand in moments like this. The airplane is not flying because of bravery. It is flying because of restraint. The pilot is doing less on purpose because doing more would break it. They descend another notch. The yaw tries to return gentle at first. The pilot counters with a whisper of power, right side slightly forward, left side slightly back. The swing quiets. The crew breathes. Clock, 2 minutes to the runway environment, if the field is where they think it is. Then the bomber hits a patch of rough air. Not dramatic turbulence, just enough to jolt a damaged structure. The tail shivers, the seam flexes, and for a beat the autopilot makes a correction that feels too strong. The nose dips. The wings roll a fraction. The fishtail flickers back. Stakes. If the autopilot overcorrects in rough air, it can feed oscillations instead of damping them. And oscillations are how damaged aircraft come apart. The rule against rough air is simple. Slow down your responses, even when your body wants to speed them up. The bombardier calls it. Hold. Let it settle. Do not chase. The pilot waits one heartbeat longer than feels safe, then makes a correction smaller than feels useful. And it works. Mini payoff. The airplane steadies again. The yaw fades. The tail does not shift farther. The bomber keeps descending, still one piece. Now the real test arrives, the part no system was meant to do for them. They need to line up. A runway approach is not straight up and down. It is a series of adjustments of tiny turns and attitude changes. Each adjustment is a question. Will the tail accept this, or will it complain? Clock 90 seconds until they have to commit to final alignment. Switch point of view, rear compartment again. The gunner watches the horizon tilt slightly as they begin the gentlest alignment turn he has ever felt. The tail flexes, not wildly, just enough to remind him it is not welded, it is wounded. He grips the frame and counts the seconds in his head because counting gives you something to hold when you cannot hold anything else. Up front, the pilot's eyes lock on the approach path. He does not try to be perfect. He tries to be survivable. He keeps the autopilot engaged for the steadiness, but his fingers are already on the switch ready. And that safety wire, that tiny twisted line of metal, keeps the guard from vibrating open as the bomber shakes. It keeps the switch protected, one less accident waiting to happen. Stakes. If the autopilot drops out at the wrong instant, they will have to hand fly a bomber with damaged controls through the most delicate phase of the flight. Clock 30 seconds. The runway is close enough now that you can almost believe it will be there for them. The pilot makes the last small throttle adjustment to quiet the yaw, and the bomber begins to track toward the line. Then the autopilot gives the faintest hiccup, a tiny hesitation in the control response, like a tired hand slipping. The co-pilot's voice sharpens. There. Did you feel that? The pilot nods without looking away. Because the next choice is brutal. Keep the autopilot in hoping it holds for another minute. Or disconnect now and take the controls that might not answer just to avoid a failure at the worst possible second. Section 4. Disconnect at the worst time because the next choice is brutal. Keep the autopilot in, hoping it holds for another minute, or disconnect now and take the controls that might not answer just to avoid a failure at the worst possible second. The pilot makes the call you make when you have learned that timing can be the difference between trouble and disaster. He disconnects, not with drama, with a simple motion, a click you can barely hear over engines and wind. But inside the cockpit, that click lands like a thunderclap. The bomber instantly feels heavier. The yoke has slack, then resistance, then slack again. It is like steering a truck with a broken linkage. The airplane is still flying, but it is no longer being held. Clock 60 seconds to touchdown, give or take. Stakes. If they cannot hold attitude and alignment, they will not just miss the runway. They will hit the ground at the wrong angle with a wounded tail that may not tolerate impact forces. The rule against a bad approach is simple. If you cannot make it stable, do not force it. But there is no easy go-around when the controls are damaged and the tail is hanging on a seam. Any climb, any power increase, any change in airflow might finish the job. They are committed to the runway because the sky is no longer a safe place. Switch, point of view, the co-pilot. He watches the pilot's hands and sees how careful they are, how small the movements become. The pilot is not flying the bomber like a bomber. He is flying it like a glass sculpture. Tiny inputs, then wait. Tiny inputs, then wait. Every correction is followed by a pause because the airplane answers late like it has to think. The co-pilot calls out the only things that matter: airspeed, sink rate, alignment. His voice is steady because a steady voice keeps a crew from chasing a moving target with panic. The yaw returns as soon as the autopilot is gone. Not wild, but present. The bomber tries to drift off centerline. The pilot counters the only way he can trust: a whisper of differential power. Left engine's a fraction more, right engine's a fraction less, then back again. It is clumsy, but it is control. The nose swings back toward the runway line and the co-pilot says it like a prayer. Hold it, hold it. Clock 40 seconds. Switch point of view, the rear compartment. Back there, the gunner can feel the approach in his bones. The air thickens. The vibration changes. The tail's flex is different now, not just from damage, but from the new forces of descent. He grips the frame and stares at the torn seam. He cannot do anything about it, but watching it feels like doing something. Stakes. If the tail drops or twists on touchdown, it could tear away. The rule against fear is simple. Do your job anyway. So he reports. Tail still holding. Flex unchanged. Small yaw oscillation. He is describing a living wound. Up front, the runway grows. The pilot keeps the airplane a few feet higher than feels normal because he is terrified of flaring too hard. A flare would pitch the nose up, change tail load, and ask damaged cables to do a job they might not do. Technical detail one you can picture. The B-17's control cables run long paths. If they are damaged, the response becomes delayed and uneven. So the pilot does not pull the airplane into a classic flare. He eases it like lowering a heavy box. Clock, 20 seconds. Mini payoff. The bomber stays lined up long enough that the runway threshold passes under them, and for a moment the landing looks possible. Then the crosswind touches them. Not violent, just a sideways breath, but sideways is the exact direction their tail cannot handle. The bomber drifts. The pilot corrects. The correction is late. The drift increases. For a split second, the airplane is not aligned. It is sliding. Stakes, a sideways touchdown is how gear collapses and tails tear. The rule against a sideways touchdown is simple. Straighten first, even if you have to sacrifice perfect glide. The pilot makes a tiny power change right side up, left side down, nudging the nose into the wind, then easing back to center. The runway edge lights blur past. The co-pilot's voice tightens for the first time. You You are drifting. You are drifting. Clock 10 seconds. The pilot does the bravest thing in this whole story. He does less again. He stops chasing perfection. He picks the one line he can hold and he commits to it. The wheels touch, not a slam. A firm, honest contact. The bomber bounces once a short hop that makes everyone's stomach drop. The pilot holds the nose steady. He does not yank. He does not fight. He lets the airplane settle. The tail shivers. The seam flexes. The rear gunner thinks he feels it open wider, and then it stops. The structure holds. Mini payoff. They are on the ground, rolling, still one piece. But the landing is not over when the wheels touch. B-17 is heavy fast and now half crippled. They need to slow without pulling the tail apart, and they need to keep straight without full control authority. Clock. The next 30 seconds are the final test. The pilot reaches for brakes carefully. Too much braking and the nose can dip, loading the tail. Too little and they run out of runway. He uses what he has again. Differential power reduced. Gentle braking. Rudder is available. Everything's small. Switch point of view, the co-pilot. He looks down at that small safety wire on the autopilot toggle guard. It is still tight, still twisted. It did not save them by itself, but it kept the switch from being bumped at the worst moment. It kept one tool available until the crew chose the right time to let it go. And that is what survival looks like sometimes. Not a hero speech. A piece of wire doing its job while men do theirs. The bomber rolls slower. The runway end approaches. The pilot keeps it straight with breath-sized inputs. The crew waits for the last surprise, and then without warning, the tail gives one final heavy shudder like a man exhaling after holding his breath too long. Everyone freezes, because a shudder on the ground can be the sound of something finally letting go. Section 5. The shudder on the rollout, everyone freezes, because a shudder on the ground can be the sound of something finally letting go. The bomber is still moving, still heavy, still fast enough that the end of the runway feels closer than it should. The pilot keeps his hands light because heavy hands make heavy consequences. The co-pilot watches the edge markers and calls distance, like he is counting down a fuse. Clock 20 seconds until they either slow enough to turn off or run out of runway. Stakes. If the tail breaks loose now on rollout, the rear structure could drop, twist, or drag. That could pull the aircraft off the runway, damage the landing gear, or turn the last surviving minute into a wreck you cannot walk away from. The rule against a ground failure is simple. Keep it straight, keep it gentle, keep it slow. Switch point of view, the rear compartment. Back there, the gunner feels the shudder travel through the floor like a shock wave. It is not one clean jolt. It is a heavy tremor that repeats a deep thump, thump, thump as the tail tries to settle into a shape it no longer knows. He stares at the torn seam and sees it flex a fraction wider than back. Cold air pours in sharp enough to sting through the layers. He does what he has done all day. He reports what is real. Tail shuddering, seam flexing, still attached. Up front, the pilot does not answer right away. He is busy making the smallest corrections of his life. The bomber wants to drift with the crosswind. The pilot counters with a trace of rudder, whatever still exists in those damaged cables, and with tiny brake taps that are more suggestion than command. He does not stomp. He does not grab. He coaxes. Technical detail, one you can picture. Brakes on a heavy bomber can grab unevenly. If one side bites harder, the aircraft yaws. And yaw is the enemy of a wounded tail. So the pilot uses brakes like a man balancing weight on ice, left, then right, then release, never letting the wheels lock, never letting the airframe feel a sudden twist. Clock, 15 seconds. The bomber slows just enough that the pilot considers a turnoff. A taxiway waits like an exit door. But turning means side load. Side load means risk. The navigator, who has been quiet since the flare, leans forward and says what everyone is thinking. If you turn now, you may tear it. The rule against an early turn is simple. Do not ask the wounded part to do new work. So they keep rolling. Switch point of view, the co-pilot. He watches the end of the runway and feels the terrible math. They need more distance than they have. He calls it anyway, calm but urgent, speed dropping. Keep it straight. We have room barely. The pilot uses differential power even on the ground, reducing thrust to idle and keeping the engine symmetrical so the bomber does not yaw. The airplane becomes quieter, and in the quiet the crew can hear things they could not hear before. A loose panel flapping, a squeal of tire, a metallic rattle in the rear that makes every neck tense. Clock, 10 seconds. Stakes. If that rattle is a structural member shifting the tail could drop. The pilot holds center line. The bomber slows again. The end of the runway grows large, but so does the feeling that they are going to make it. Mini payoff. The aircraft decelerates into a speed that feels survivable, and for the first time since the collision, the pilot allows one exhale that is not controlled. Then the tail shudders again. Harder. The rear gunner feels it like someone kicked the fuselage. He sees the seam flare wider, just for a blink enough that his mind fills the gap with the image of the tail finally separating. He braces, jaw clenched under the oxygen mask, waiting for the sickening drop. It does not drop. The tail holds, but something has changed. The flex is different now. The seam does not return to the same line. It settles a hair lower like a shoulder slipping out of joint. He keys the mic, tail sagging slightly, still attached. Up front, the pilot hears it and keeps his face empty. He cannot let the crew hear alarm in him because the airplane does not need alarm. It needs steadiness. Clock 5 seconds until they must make a decision about stopping straight ahead or trying to turn. The rule against the runway end is simple. If you cannot stop in time, you must steer. If you cannot steer safely, you must stop harder. Either option has consequences. The co-pilot calls out the remaining distance. The pilot chooses the least violent solution. A firmer braking, still controlled still even, but enough to bring the bomber down before the pavement disappears. The bomber slows. Tires squeal briefly, then quiet. The nose dips a fraction, and every man in the aircraft feels the tail load increase like a weight hanging from the back of a truck. Stakes. If the tail cannot take this last load, it will fail here at the end. The pilot eases off a touch, finds the line between stopping and braking. He holds that line for 2 long heartbeats. Mini payoff. The bomber stops. Straight. Still intact. Silence is not the right word. The engines are still there at idle. The wind still combs the broken seam. Men still breathe through masks. But the motion is gone. And without motion, the fear changes shape. It becomes a slow realization. They are alive. Switch point of view, the pilot. He does not celebrate. He keeps his hands on the controls for another moment, because letting go feels like tempting fate. He looks down at the panel, at the switches and guards that have stayed where they belonged. His eyes land again on that small safety wire, twisted and clipped. It has done what it was supposed to do. It kept a switch from drifting, kept a guard from vibrating open, kept one option available until they chose the moment to let it go. He thinks not in poetry, but in hard truth. In the air, a small mistake can be fatal. On the ground, a small mistake can still be fatal. The navigator unclips his mask and tastes the air, dry and dusty. The bombardier sits back and realizes his hands are shaking. The co-pilot looks over his shoulder, as if he can see through the fuselage and check that the tail is still there. In the back, the gunner hears footsteps as men begin to move. The seam creaks. Everyone freezes again. Clock. The next 30 seconds determine whether they can even climb out without shifting the damage. The rule against post-landing collapse is simple. Move slow. Keep weight centered. Do not disturb what is barely holding. The pilot speaks into the interphone, voice low. Nobody rush. Stay seated until we know. Outside, ground crews are running, pointing, staring at the impossible sight of a bomber that should not have made it. But inside, nobody cares about amazement yet. They care about one thing. Will the tail hold long enough for the men to step out? The co-pilot reaches toward the interphone cord, and in the movement, his sleeve brushes near the autopilot area. He pauses instantly, eyes snapping to that wired guard, remembering how close a small bump could have come to disaster. He pulls his arm back carefully, like the wire itself is a warning, and that is the cliffhanger they carry into the next moment. Because surviving the landing is one thing. Surviving what happens when you finally stand up inside a broken airplane is another. Continue. Section 6. Walking out of a broken airplane. Because surviving the landing is one thing. Surviving what happens when you finally stand up inside a broken airplane is another. For a few seconds, nobody moves. They sit in their stations and listen to the airplane settle. Metal cooling. Canvas straps creaking. The wind finding the torn seam and humming through it like a flute. It is a different kind of fear now. Not the sharp fear of impact, but the slow fear of collapse, the fear that the structure is only pretending to hold until you shift your weight. Clock 30 seconds to decide whether to evacuate now, or wait and risk fire-delayed damage or another failure. Stakes. If the rear fuselage is hanging by fragments, one careless step, one sudden shift could pull it loose. If it drops while men are moving, it could trap someone. It could injure someone. It could turn survival into something else. The rule against post-crash chaos is simple. Move like you are carrying glass. Switch point of view, the rear gunner. He is staring at the seam when he hears footsteps forward. Not footsteps on the floor. The idea of footsteps. Because nobody should be stepping anywhere yet. He raises his hand, palm out, as if the men near him can see it. Hold. Slow. A crew chief voice from somewhere outside yells words they cannot quite make out through the fuselage and the engines at idle. A ladder thumps against the side. You can hear hands on aluminum. You can hear excitement, disbelief, and the urgency of people running toward what should not exist. Inside, the pilot's voice comes over the interphone. Stay seated. One at a time. Keep weight forward. That last instruction matters. Weight forward. Do not load the rear. Do not make the wounded tail carry anything extra. The co-pilot reaches toward his harness buckle, then pauses. He looks again at the autopilot area, at that toggle guard held shut by a thin length of safety wire. It looks ridiculous almost. A tiny spiral of metal in a world of engines and armor plate. And yet, it has been part of the chain that kept them alive. The rule against careless hands is simple. Do not touch what you do not need to touch. He unbuckles without brushing it. Clock 20 seconds. The navigator shifts his knees carefully, like shifting weight on a cracked step. The bombardier keeps one hand on the table edge, using it to stabilize himself as he rises. The pilot turns his head slowly, checking faces, counting. Everyone is conscious. Everyone is breathing. Records differ on small details of the aftermath, but the outcome is consistent. None of the crew were injured. That is the miracle. Not a dramatic rescue. Just no blood, no broken bones, no man left behind. Switch point of view, the pilot. He looks at the controls one last time as if the aircraft might change its mind. He advances the mixture to cut off, then shuts engines down in sequence. Each engine winds down with a throaty groan. and the world gets quieter in steps. When the last prop stops, the silence hits harder than noise ever did. Clock 10 seconds until the airplane becomes fully still, and the crew can hear every creak. The tail creaks, a soft, dry sound of stressed metal. The pilot freezes again. Everyone does. A creak is a warning. A creak is the aircraft telling you where the pain is. Stakes. If the tail gives now, it could fold down. It could collapse the rear floor. It could crush a man who is standing in the wrong spot. The rule against a collapse is simple. Keep your body away from the damage line. So the pilot points not with drama, but with a measured gesture. Forward exit only. No one goes aft. No one looks for souvenirs. No one checks damage from inside. The bombardier moves first, stepping like he is crossing a frozen pond. The navigator follows. The co-pilot goes next, keeping one hand on a frame, using touch to read the aircraft's mood. Switch point of view outside. A ground crewman climbs the ladder and looks in, and his face changes. He expected a bomber. He sees a bomber that has been half opened. The rear fuselage is sagging, torn, buckled. It looks like it was bent by giant hands. He whistles without realizing it. Inside, the crew moves toward the hatch. Mini payoff. One man steps down onto the ladder, then another, and the airplane does not shift. The pilot waits until most of his crew is out before he moves. That is not Hollywood. That is command. He takes one last look at the cockpit, at the instruments that stayed alive long enough, at the wires and switches that did what they were supposed to do. His eyes land again on the safety wire, still twisted, still clipped, still holding the guard shut as if it is refusing to let the story end without being noticed. He steps around it. He climbs down. Outside, the air smells different. Dust, fuel, hot metal cooling. The men stand on the ground, and for the first time in hours, their bodies remember gravity without vibration. Some of them laugh once, a short breath that escapes. Some of them just stare at the airplane, trying to understand how it stayed together. Switch point of view, the rear gunner. He walks around the side until he can see the damage with his own eyes. The rear fuselage is nearly severed. You can see structure peeled back, a jagged line where it should be smooth. It is obvious now. One more violent movement and it would have been gone. He thinks about the yaw, the crosswind, the last bounce. He thinks about how close they came without knowing exactly how close. Clock. The next 5 minutes are when adrenaline leaves and reality arrives. Stakes. The reality is that this could have been different. That small choices made it not different. The rule against forgetting is simple. Remember what actually saved you. Not one hero moment. A chain. A crew that did less when doing more would have broken the airplane. A system used in a way it was not intended. And that thin safety wire, small enough to ignore that, kept a guard shut and a switch protected when hands were shaking. A medic checks them anyway. A crew chief asks questions. Names are written down. The men answer, still half in the air, still hearing engines that are no longer turning. And now the question becomes something else. What do you do with a bomber that made it home, but cannot fly again? The men watch as ground crew secure the tail brace, support it so it will not fold under its own weight. They watch the airplane become a patient, not a weapon. Clock, 1 hour until the sun shifts and the cold gets sharper. But inside the crew, the clock that matters is longer. Because years from now, you will still hear the sound of that collision. You will still feel the tail drift. You will still see that tiny twist of wire and think about how a story can turn on something you barely notice. And in the next section, that is exactly where we go. Into the aftermath, the inspection, And the moment someone points at the damage and realizes the crew did not just survive, they learned a rule they will never forget. Section 7. The inspection that proved the impossible. And in the next section, that is exactly where we go. Into the aftermath, the inspection, and the moment someone points at the damage and realizes the crew did not just survive, they learned a rule they will never forget. The bomber sits on the field like a stunned animal, still warm in places, already cooling in others. Men circle it without touching it first, the way you circle a cracked wall you do not trust. A ground crewman runs a hand along the fuselage forward of the brake, then pulls it back as if the airplane might bite. Clock 5 minutes until the first full look at the tail, the moment the crew learns whether they flew home on structure or on accident. Stakes. If the damage is worse than they think, it means the difference between skill and luck was razor thin. It means next time a similar hit could end the story. The rule about damage assessment is simple. Do not assume you know until you see. Switch point of view, the crew chief. He climbs up on a ladder and peers into the torn seam. He has seen battle damage before. Holes, shrapnel tears. But this is different. This is a near separation. This is a rear half that wanted to depart and did not. He looks at the longerons and frames the skeleton under the skin. He sees where metal is stretched, where rivet lines are distorted, where the structure is holding by stubborn geometry, and whatever pieces did not fail. He looks back at the crew standing in a loose line, flight jackets unzipped now, oxygen masks off, faces pale from cold and adrenaline. They do not look like heroes. They look like men who have been awake inside a storm. He says it quietly because quiet feels respectful to an airplane that just saved lives. How did you keep it controllable? Switch point of view, the pilot. The pilot does not answer with pride. He answers with process. We did not keep it controllable. We kept it from getting worse. We let the system hold it until we could not, then we did less. We used power to stop yaw. We kept it straight. We avoided a hard flare. He leaves out the part about fear. Everyone already knows that part. The crew chief nods, and he points at the rear seam with a gloved finger. He points at where the fuselage is nearly cut, where a narrow band of structure still connects front to rear like a bridge that should have fallen. Clock 2 minutes until the crew chief decides whether anyone is allowed near the tail. Stakes. One careless push. One man leaning on the wrong panel could finish the separation and injure someone on the ground. The rule against curiosity is simple. Do not touch what you cannot afford to move. He orders men to brace it first. Supports go under the sagging section. Straps and blocks whatever they have placed like splints. Only then does he let anyone step closer. The rear gunner comes up last. He has been staring at this damage in his head for an hour, and now he sees it in daylight. The gap is larger than he imagined. The tear is ugly, jagged, and real. He swallows, and his mind runs the last 10 seconds of flight again. The yaw, the crosswind, the bounce, the decision to do less. Mini payoff. Seeing the damage confirms it. The crew did not exaggerate. They flew a machine that should not have flown. But confirmation has a sting, because it also confirms how close they were. Switch point of view, the bombardier. He stands under the wing and looks toward the cockpit, and for the first time he lets himself think about the system they used. The bomb sight servo system and autopilot were built to steady a line over a target. Today they became a steering wheel, made of gears and small corrections. It worked because nobody asked it to do too much at once. He walks up to the cockpit ladder and looks at the panel. The switches, the guards, the small pieces that keep human hands from making accidental choices. His eyes land on it again. That thin safety wire, It is still twisted through the guard, still clipped, still exactly where it was when they took off. It looks like nothing, a scrap of discipline. He touches it with one finger gently, not moving it, just confirming it exists. Clock. 30 seconds until someone says the sentence that changes the way the crew understands what happened. The crew chief looks from the wire to the bombardier, then to the pilot. He nods once. That is why you still had the option. That is why the switch did not get bumped when everything shook. That is why your steady hand stayed available until you chose to let it go. The rule about survival systems is simple. The small safeguards matter most when hands are shaking. The pilot hears that and feels something settle in him. Not relief, understanding. Because this is the lesson the war teaches in 1,000 ways. You do not always survive because you are stronger. Sometimes you survive because the smallest things did not fail, and because you treated the smallest decisions like they were life and death. Switch point of view, the rear gunner again. He looks at the torn seam and thinks about the moment the tail drifted, polite and impossible. He thinks about how the airplane felt alive. He thinks about how it held together because a crew held together. And then a man from maintenance says something that chills the air. If you had yawed harder on final, it would have gone. It is said without drama, just as a fact, like a weather report. But the words land heavy. Clock. One heartbeat to understand what that means. Stakes. It means that the line between home and loss was not miles. It was inches. It was seconds. It was a choice to do less. The pilot does not answer. He looks at the runway behind them, then back at the airplane, and he feels the delayed shock wash through him. Not fear now. Gratitude mixed with anger at how close it was. The crew chief starts writing up the damage report. Ground staff take photographs. Men bring tools. The bomber becomes a case study, but the crew standing there begins to drift apart in small ways. One man sits on a tire and stares at the ground. Another lights a cigarette with shaking fingers. Another laughs softly, a sound that is not joy but release. And then the base officer appears with questions. Names, times, what happened exactly. Records differ on minor points of the fight, but the outcome is consistent. The B-17 landed safely. None of the crew were injured. The aircraft returned. Now the story starts to move from survival to memory. Clock. 1 hour until the crew is back in briefing rooms, retelling the moment, trying to make it orderly. Stakes. The mind will try to smooth it out. The mind will try to make it less sharp. But if you smooth it too much, you forget what really mattered. The rule against forgetting the real lesson is simple. Write down the small detail before the big story takes over. The bombardier looks again at the safety wire and thinks, I will remember that. Because in the next section, time moves forward. The bomber gets patched, the crew gets reassigned, and the question becomes the one that follows every miracle. How do you climb back into the sky, knowing how thin the margin really is? Section 8. Getting back in the air with the memory of inches. How do you climb back into the sky, knowing how thin the margin really is? It starts in a briefing room that smells like coffee gone cold and damp wool. Maps on the wall, chalk marks, a table scarred by elbows and paperwork. The crew sits spaced out, not because anyone told them to, but because their bodies still remember how close they were inside that fuselage. Clock 15 minutes until the next assignment board goes up and the war asks for another flight. Stakes. If they carry the wrong lesson forward, they will either freeze up or get reckless. Both can get you killed. The rule after a near loss is simple. Tell the truth, not the legend. A base officer asks for the story, and the pilot gives it in the order that matters. Attack, impact, tail drifting, controls slack, autopilot and servo steadiness. differential power to manage yaw. A landing done with restraint. No speeches, no boasting, just the sequence. Switch point of view the co-pilot. He can still feel the hiccup in the control response on final. He can still hear his own voice getting tight for the first time. You are drifting. He hates that his voice changed, but he also knows it was honest. Honesty is how you survive the next time. He watches the officer write and he realizes something else. The report will become words on paper. The words will become a lesson for men who were not in that cockpit. That is the strange afterlife of survival. Your fear turns into a paragraph. Outside, mechanics move around the bomber like surgeons. Braces stay under the tail. Tools clink. Hands point at the torn seam and trace the path of failure that did not fully happen. Clock. 1 hour until the aircraft is declared grounded or salvageable. Stakes. If the airplane cannot fly again, it becomes a warning. If it can, it becomes a temptation. The rule about wounded machines is simple. Do not confuse it. Made it once, with it can do it again. Most of the crew is not thinking about the aircraft's future. They are thinking about their own. Because the war does not stop to admire what you survived. A new mission briefing begins. Different target area, same cold sky, same long return. The crew listens, and every detail lands differently now. A route line on a map is not just a line. It is time. It is fuel. It is distance from help. It is minutes you cannot afford to lose. Switch point of view the bombardier. He watches a technician explain a system on the board, and his mind returns to the bomb site servo and autopilot. That system was meant to steady a bombing run, and it saved them because it was steady when hands were shaking. He thinks about the safety wire again, not as a charm, but as a fact. A guard stayed shut. A switch stayed protected. A tool stayed available until the right moment. He does not say it out loud, but he writes it in the margin of his notes, a private reminder. Small safeguards matter. Clock 2 days until they fly again, maybe sooner depending on the tempo. Stakes. The next time something fails, the crew will reach for habits first. Habits can save you, or doom you. The rule about habits is simple. Build the right ones before you need them. The pilot walks the flight line later and stops beside another bomber. He runs his glove over a panel seam and thinks about the seam that opened on his own aircraft. He looks at the control cables on a maintenance diagram and thinks about slack and delay. He looks at the autopilot guard and sees the wire, not the metal, the discipline. He talks to ground crew for a minute quietly, like you talk to people who keep you alive without ever leaving the earth. He does not ask for luck. He asks for checks. He asks for guards to be secure. He asks for the small things to be treated like the big things. Mini payoff. A crew chief nods and says, "We will double check it." That is not applause, but it is comfort. Switch point of view, the rear gunner. At night he lies in a bunk and tries to sleep. The bunk creaks. He stiffens. The tail creaked too. The mind does not care that it is a different sound. The mind is still in the airplane. He closes his eyes and sees daylight where daylight does not belong. He hears the collision like a bell. He feels the drift. He thinks about inches, not miles, inches, clock. The hours until dawn, when fatigue makes everything harder. Stakes. If you cannot sleep, you cannot think. If you cannot think, you make errors. And errors are what fighters in gravity wait for. The rule about fear is simple. You do not erase it. You learn to carry it without letting it steer. In the morning, the crew gathers again, not because they are friends, but because they are a unit of memory. They exchange small details. The moment the tail drifted, the moment the autopilot steadied, the moment the wheels bounced once and then settled. They keep it factual because facts are how you keep the story from turning into something that lies to you. And then a final detail returns to the surface, the one that feels too small to matter. That thin safety wire. It is a quiet reminder that the war is not only fought with guns. It is fought with maintenance, with discipline, with one small choice made on the ground that holds in the air. Clock. The next flight is coming, and the next section is where we close the circle with the last look at the bomber, the last look at that wire, and the lesson you can carry, even when you have never flown a day in your life. Continue. Section 9. The small detail that held the whole sky. And the next section is where we close the circle with the last look at the bomber, the last look at that wire, and the lesson you can carry even when you have never flown a day in your ice. Life. Days pass. The field changes. New aircraft arrive. The war keeps moving because it always does. But the All-American does not move the same way anymore. It sits under braces and tarps surrounded by men who measure, photograph, and argue quietly over what should have failed. Clock. 1 week until the story becomes paperwork, and the paperwork becomes a paragraph in a file cabinet. Stakes. If the story becomes only a headline, you lose the useful part. You lose the chain of small choices that kept the airplane in one piece. The rule about survival stories is simple. Do not let the loud moment erase the small ones. Switch point of view a mechanic. He has no interest in legend. He is interested in cause. He points at the torn seam and traces the forces with a pencil. Here is where it flexed. Here is where it nearly separated. Here is why a hard yaw would have finished it. He says it like a man explaining a cracked beam in a house. Then he climbs up to the cockpit and sees the thing that does not belong in a dramatic story. A thin safety wire, twisted, clipped, holding a guard shut over a toggle. A little piece of ground crew discipline that did not fly the bomber, but kept the bomber from losing the option that mattered until the crew chose the right second to let it go. He turns to the pilot and says almost gently, "If that guard had opened on its own, you might have lost your steady hand right when you needed it." The pilot does not argue. He just nods once because he can feel the truth of it in his bones. Mini payoff. The crew finally understands the shape of their survival. It was not one miracle. It was a chain that did not break. Switch point of view the pilot. He walks away from the aircraft at dusk and stops once to look back. The tail is still there, supported, now quiet. He thinks about how the airplane drifted in the sky like a wounded thing trying to leave. He thinks about how he disconnected the autopilot at the worst time on purpose because he refused to let the machine choose the moment of failure. He thinks about how he used throttle differences like fingertips because the pedals lied. And he thinks about that wire, not as luck, as a reminder that preparation lives in small places. The war is full of big machines and loud moments, but big machines survive on small habits. Clock. Years later, you will still remember the smallest sound. The sound is not the engines. It is the click of a guard that stayed shut. Lesson for the audience. The detail that keeps a story from breaking is often smaller than the story itself. On that February day, the crew survived because they did not chase the airplane when it was wounded. They chose restraint timing and a system that could hold steady when hands were shaking. But the quiet hinge of it all was a thin safety wire keeping a guard shut, keeping a switch protected until the exact moment they chose to disconnect. In your world, it might be a checklist line, a latch you always verify, a habit you never skip. Small safeguards do not feel heroic until the minute everything rattles and they are the only thing still doing their job. That's soldiers' lost voices, where the smallest details still carry the loudest echoes. Here on Soldiers' Lost Voices, we chase the small details that change the whole outcome. Small details change everything. If one detail in this story stayed with you, tell me what it was in the comments and why. And if there is a moment, aircraft, or survival story you want us to dig into next, drop it below. The end.